So yes, you can teach an old dog new tricks, and the question is for us is to sort of, if we can figure out what our competencies are, and create this bank, this knowledge bank of what your competencies are, and then you can extend that to what are the other types of occupations that you might be suited for. Because we know, for example, coming out of this recession, that there has been structural change, that the nature of jobs have changed. Not only have we changed the composition of occupations for particular states, but also the education required, the competencies required, the certifications required have changed. So we need to know, for example, if you think of myself as an example, we need to know what my competencies are, how best can I parlay that into another occupation. And the best example I can think of that where this works is with veterans. When vets return, a lot of them have many types of very highly developed skills that they must try to figure out how best to translate that into civilian environment. So there's an entire set of people that are there to assist them with that. We don't have the equivalent, I think, for adult workforce who are displaced. You have to try to figure out, whenever I talk to young graduates, even from Georgetown, who might have graduated in degrees in liberal arts, and they're wondering, well, what am I going to do with this English degree? I say, you don't necessarily focus on what this degree is, but you focus on what are the competencies you've achieved once you've completed this degree. And then you figure out how those competencies can be translated into other jobs. So it's sort of a different way of thinking, not only what certification, what degree, what high school diploma I have, but how best can I translate my skills into what's required for working?
Well, let me ask you, and also ask some other folks here that might want, what you're describing is a very complex process, because most people aren't that introspective about their aspirations and their skills. I think I would describe my own career, as most of my friends, as floundering until I found something. And so I didn't have anybody necessarily. I also was a first-generation college student, and there was no one to rely on to give me that kind of advice. And I think that when we look at the public workforce system, which we all agree is a very under-resourced system, and I say broadly defined, which is also workforce development, education, K through 12 and post-secondary, it is not a system where there's been a lot of one-on-one counseling. There's, we talk a little bit about needing the high touch and that kind of counseling, but also we need to infuse some high tech for those who are much more self-service. And I know, I'm going to ask you to answer that, and I know Ted wants to answer that as well, but what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'm happy you used the word floundering, because whenever
it's one of my favorite words about my career,
but whenever I talk to an higher ed audience, I have to always begin the discussion focusing on the fact that the purpose of education is not only for workforce development, because they get a little bit sensitive about that.
A little touchy about that.
Yeah, they get a little bit touchy. Well, when I was in college, we found ourselves, and I said, I don't want to find myself unemployed for the next 6 years. So we have to figure out. but I know I'm being a little bit flip about this, but what's important, I think, here as well is information. So we have to know, it's much different now. When you look at college tuition rates and how they've risen much faster than the rate of inflation, we need to know what matters, which ones mattered, how much do they matter, how much will they pay, what can I expect in my initial salary, which ones have well-defined career pathways. And I didn't get a chance to tell you this because we also have data on trying to forecast where the jobs are. But one of the highest growing occupational clusters in Mississippi right now is in healthcare support. One of my issues with healthcare support is that healthcare support does not have well-developed career pathways that take you into the healthcare professional types of jobs that Governor Bryant was speaking about, the types of nurses and the hospitals that he's thinking of building, and those types of schools. So if we focus only on where the jobs are, not necessarily the composition of those jobs and which ones are high wage, high skill, high demand jobs, then we run the risk of training people for jobs to nowhere. So it's really important that we have information on which ones, which types. Right now there's White and Rubio bill right to know before you go. And it's really important that students have that information. It's a right to know before you go. A full information set about expectations, a full information set about the type of debt we're going to take on and how we can actually have the ability to repay that.
Well, and if Mississippi legalizes marijuana, everyone will be high as addition to being in a high-growth job. So, Ted, you wanted to have some comments on that?
I don't know about the lead-in, but I
wasn't implying anything, though you did grow up on a farm, you said.
Yeah, I did grow up on a farm, yeah. And the idea of a baler is just, anyway. A couple thoughts. I mean, one is maybe we should have one of these conferences with daycare workers instead of higher education people. I've never done that. I think I've been to every type of economic development, but we haven't had a daycare worker one. And if we really believe that that's where the early learning, and I agree with you completely. I think I agree with you, too, that those big numbers are big numbers, and they get down to a level. And, you know, Chris, I know we're doing some work at DRA out in the communities on this, but I'm torn because, you know, one of the numbers we looked at in the last few weeks is poverty rates across all southern states. And we looked at them 30 years ago. And we were talking at the table at our conference recently, we talked about a nation at risk, a study from 30 years ago. And you basically could print it today. And the poverty rates in the South, in the world in the last 30 years, about 1 billion people have come out of poverty. And in our southern states, we're about even. In several states, and I don't remember Mississippi slightly up or slightly down, but poverty rates are about the same. We've effectively had no impact on something that we've spent lots of money trying to impact. And I think that it is not because people aren't trying. I don't think it's because there aren't individuals who are, making it and moving out. I think that we have this systemic problem of what's going on in the world around us. And we also have I said the talent bar was rising. Well, we also have a moving average. And with groups, sometimes I ask, everybody who thinks you're above average intelligence to stand up. And then I ask the people who are above average motivation to stand up and above average soft skill to stand up. And one of the problems is that the bar that we're setting today is for the people who stay stood up on the far end of that bar. And structurally in the economy, we're creating a lot of jobs at the lower third of the pay scale, more than 40% in almost every southern state, some approaching 50%. And so even while we're making some progress, we don't have the career pathways. The training systems to move people up aren't there. There's no connectivity for adult workers to get you from the $12 an hour job to the $20 an hour job. You either get into that system or not. And I think that it is more granular. You do have to do more things. But we tend to want to say on one of these panels, here are the 2 things everybody ought to do. Mm-hmm. And this is really hard and complex, and we're going to have to embrace that complexity sometime, or we're going to continue to flounder.
I'd like just to comment on the poverty issue. Given that Mississippi is a rather rural state, I can imagine that I don't see it exactly in my data, but one can extrapolate from my results. I think that transportation issues are a big problem for poor people. And given that Mississippi is also a rural state, how do you get to the jobs? Often people who are poor have rather unreliable cars. I think my mic, perhaps my, yeah, there.
They're direct.
So, and I think relating it to the soft skills issue, a lot of production jobs require punctuality. But how do you get, if you can't get to your job on time because of lack of public transportation or because your car is unreliable, that's a real showstopper for a lot of factories. So I think that's another issue that's very local that thank you that one might want to focus on. And I'd like to also comment on Nicole's points about improving educational attainment and perhaps vocational training or customized training. A lot of the time it's not as much about helping people get a job, but also making sure that they keep a job, so for firms to prevent turnover. And I think that's also where soft skills matter a lot. Just how do you structure a career ladder for people so they know which skills they can apply.
I'm sorry, I need to follow up on this. But as you know, I have a beautiful accent, and I'm not even from around here, as people say. But I'm a passionate Mississippian. I will say a couple of things. Everything we just talked about today is absolutely correct. The problem is that if we don't change the image of ourselves, and if we don't change the attitude, we can do it. That's what's really creating the problem most of the time. So instead of highlighting the success, and that's what we've done in the state, and I'm very proud to say that the state is taking very important steps to highlight the best practices instead of highlighting what doesn't work. We know we have the poorest, one of the largest poorest population in the state. We know all the a health issue and so on and so forth. But we also have been committed to change the way we're going to basically talk about workforce issue. Where are the things that are really working? The state has recognized that we can't focusing only on a small segment of the populations. The low income, the most vulnerable, yes, they're important, but how can you do workforce development if you don't engage harder segment of the population? So the state has changed really the way they're thinking about the workforce. I can help the one at the bottom if I can help the one at the top. Because they're the one that create the wealth, they're the one that's going to create the economic conditions, the tax revenue, and the resources going to help us to do what we need to do at the bottom. So I think at the end of the day, one of the things that I noticed in 15 years of being in Mississippi is that we need to change the image. And it's an image that there are expectations that we can actually achieve with the attitude we can do it. But if we keep saying, okay, the poor people, they won't be able to get a job, and so that thing kind of stick in people's head, and you're talking about consciousness or sense of efficacy, as we say, you lose that. You lose the ability to get up in the morning and say, I would like to go and find a job. So that's one thing. The second thing is that our business community also start recognizing that the workforce is the most valuable assets that they have. So they see something at stake for their own sustainability. So the rhetoric and the debate in the state is no longer about one sector of the economy and the other, but it's rather how can we help to sustain the economy, so it's sustainability. So all the issue of workforce in the state are now basically framed within the context of everybody should be actually part of the workforce, the discussion. The business community is more interested in making sure that they're sustainable, viable over time, so they're more active in terms of helping us figure out what are the problems. And also the state as a state has changed the way it's addressing the issue from more kind of a system perspective rather than kind of silos, it's not my responsibility, it's your responsibility. So anyway, I think.
I just want to say, I agree with you that it is not one group. In fact, I would challenge that the biggest change for workforce systems coming up is that your audience is everybody. It is not the people who apply to this program or who enroll in this class. The workforce supply in Mississippi is every child born to everybody dying. And every single one of them needs workforce support, training, skills. They need stackable, quantifiable credentials their whole life. And we need to reinvent workforce as something. It's like television or the internet. It's for everybody. You have to plug in whenever you can across your whole life and not think about it in terms of programmatic, how much money did I get for this year? It is information driven, I agree with you completely, but it's everybody. So it's not about how do I fix this group of poor people in this neighborhood. It is about how do I provide services for everybody and in a way that they can plug in.
And since we're talking about challenges to the system, I think there's just 2 points I wanted to highlight. So we've done a little bit of research trying to figure out where the jobs will be and what can we expect of the future. And we have a statistic that says in 2020, 51% of all jobs in Mississippi will require some sort of post-secondary education and training beyond high school. In addition to that, the second point I want to make is that Mississippi is a net exporter of young college grads. And that, to me, I was really disturbed when we sort of looked at that statistic, because we divided a little bit of methodology without getting too bogged down. We divided the set of information we were looking at into young people under the age of 35, and to mature workers who were 35 and over. And we found that Mississippi was different from the other states in that the young BAs were the ones who were leaving the state, and the mature workers who were leaving the state in search of other jobs were actually those who were sub-BA. What that means to me is that in some ways, what the governor spoke about earlier, he wants to create an opportunity and a job for every person from Mississippi that wants one. We're actually training our young workers to go elsewhere. And what's happening with the mature workers is that we're losing a lot of experience and skill. So even though when our statistic looks at your education attainment, there's a lot of skill embodied in there in workforce, especially for manufacturing. So when we lose that, we are creating a tax base elsewhere. So the challenge is to figure out what's going on here. How can we ensure that we maintain the types of jobs and opportunity that keep our workforce in here? So when Ted mentions that we're looking at everybody, the challenge is everyone. To some extent it is. The unemployment rate today in Mississippi is still 8.5%. It's still over a percentage point higher than the national average. We're still concerned about how best we can train not only the mature workforce, but also the extremely high levels of unemployed youth that who some of them have never worked consistently in a job for over 4 or 5 months.
So before I open it up to the audience and having a dialogue with the audience, one of the things I wanted to ask everybody, when I listen to some of the things you're saying, my first reaction is it's always like there's not enough money in the system to be able to deal with all this. But are we asking, and I don't want to go that place because that's where everyone goes and it's always a killer conversation. But are there questions they should be asking? Are there new questions they should be asking? Are there new things they should be thinking about? Looking at technology and some of these demographic trends, are there different ways that they should be thinking about their conversation given what you said?
Well, I mean, the issue of resources, of course, more resources is always better, but unfortunately we do not have more resources. So first we need to recognize that we do not have unlimited resources. So the next place is, okay, if the resources are not unlimited, how we manage things in a way that we can do more with less. So technology becomes a big issue. I think Mark Henry probably will talk about how the agency has addressed the issue of trying to do more with less with using technology. So that's one part. The other part of management is that, we are all interconnected. And so why we have to duplicate efforts when we can actually make sure that we have efforts stacked on top of each other. So when one group provides a service, the other service comes along and provide whatever else is left and is to be provided. So streamline and reducing duplications. So I think there are ways to do things with less without sacrificing the quality of the service. And that requires a change of cultural kind of a mentality, a change of paradigm in the way you use public funds to address complex issues like this. So, at the end of the day, we have to do more with less.
The quote that's on my wall in my office is a Teddy Roosevelt quote that's do what you can with what you have where you are. It doesn't do anybody any good here to talk about things that aren't going to be real. So you can try to change your resources or your paradigms or whatever, but tomorrow there are still people out there who need help, and they're Mississippians who you're going to be able to help. Celebrate the ones you can, do all the good you can with all the stuff you have, and go to the next day and do it again.